With that, I'd like to introduce our speakers. We have a wonderful panel tonight, and I'm going to go through them. We have 4 speakers. The first person I'm going to introduce tonight is our keynote speaker. Is this working now? It's not yet. Okay. Our keynote speaker is someone local to us, Dr. Gregory Anderson, the Dean and Associate Professor in Education here at the Mordridge College of Education at the University of Denver. Prior to coming to the University of Denver, Dr. Anderson was an Associate Professor at Columbia University's Teachers College. In 2006, he took an extended leave to become the Higher Education Policy Program Officer for the Ford Foundation in New York. He oversaw one of their largest portfolios, which featured grants for both international and domestic higher education. Dr. Anderson also sat on executive committees of multi-foundation partnerships and foundation-wide initiatives involving the United States, Africa, and Central Latin America, and Asia. In 2008, he was appointed by the Vice President of the Foundation's Knowledge, Creativity, and Freedom Program Division to lead a strategic planning team responsible for developing a new vision for the U.S. and international higher education programming. Our second speaker will be Shakir Ishaq. Mr. Ishaq is the Chief Executive of Basic Education for Awareness, Reforms and Empowerment, or Basic Education for Afghan Refugees, which has the catchy acronym Be Fair. Mr. Ishaq is a development aid professional with over 25 years of professional experience. After obtaining a degree in civil engineering from Iowa State University, he started his professional career with the Provincial Government Development Department of the Northwestern Frontier Province of Pakistan, which was followed by his entry into the corporate sector. He joined the social sector in 2003 after accepting the position of Chief Executive of the newly formed NGO, Be Fair. For the past 9 years, he has led the organization with a vision to expand the thematic as well as geographical area of its work, which, besides covering the original mandate of providing basic education, expanded its work into other areas such as vocational trainings, community development, mother and child health, democratization, alternative energy, water and sanitation, and institutional development. Shakir has served as a member of the board of the Elementary Education Foundation of Northwestern Province in Pakistan government for 3 years and is also a member of the working group of the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies. I'd also like to share with you 2 points that I learned about Mr. Ishaq while I was talking with him before the panel. One, he was abducted by the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in April 2008 where he was held for 1 year. So we're very glad to have him with us. The second interesting point about Mr. Ishaq is that he's also an accomplished pilot, which is something that he, I think, rarely shares with people, but so he's a man of hidden talents. Okay, our third speaker will be Ms. Amy Rhodes. Amy Rhodes is a journalist and skills specialist at the International Labor Organization. And she works with the International Labor Organization and the Ministry of Education of the Dominican Republic. She has over 8 years of experience in international education and skills development with a particular focus on the right to education in emergency contexts. Following the devastating earthquake of 2010, she lived and worked with internally displaced youth in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. While in Haiti, she wrote a series of feature articles for the ILO and co-authored an academic article for the Migration Policy Practice Journal. Amy is a member of the Adolescent and Youth Task Team for the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies, and holds an MA in International Law and Human Rights from United Nations University for Peace in Costa Rica. She's based in Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic. Our fourth speaker is Maria Jessup. Ms. Jessup is a Senior Program Officer at the Academy for International Conflict Management and Peace Building at the United States Institute of Peace. At USIP's Academy, Maria develops and implements education and training programs in conflict and post-conflict contexts. As part of USIP's Iraq team, Maria has been leading civic and human rights education projects in Iraq's education sector since 2008. She specializes in facilitated dialogue approaches to resolving intergroup conflict, fostering reconciliation, engaging civil society in community problem solving, and teaching civil and human rights education. She has both trained and facilitated dialogue among civil society leaders in Iraq, Colombia, and Haiti. As part of the State Department's Africa Contingency Operation Training and Assistance Program, Maria also regularly conducts negotiation training in multiple African countries for UN peacekeeping officers. She has previously worked as a mediator, trainer, and cross-cultural specialist with federal, educational, and community-based organizations in New York, Los Angeles, Puerto Rico, and Costa Rica. Okay, we have some very distinguished panelists with some very complicated acronyms in those bios. So I'm glad I survived that part for one. So with that, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Dean Anderson. If you would please, Dean Anderson. Thank you.
You know, I don't need a mic. Hopefully you can hear me all. Can you hear me? Okay. So I'm not sure this is really appropriately a keynote address or a speech. Really what I want to do is lay out some general themes, providing an overview, and then essentially let the symposium take a life of its own. And then in between there have a dialogue, and I really would enjoy listening to your questions and you know, providing answers, as well as giving the panelists an opportunity to do some answers as well. So my fake keynote address involves challenges in global education, an overview, all right? And essentially, there are a couple of things that I want to do. First, I want to frame what I believe is at stake. And I'm going to make what I don't think is a controversial statement based on my own assumption, but here it is. There are no more grand experiments and global alternatives to capitalism. There, I said it, right? When I was a student, studying things like third world politics and looking at the world as it was, there were alternatives. There were grand alternatives. We studied them. There was capitalism, there was communism, and there was something else in between called socialism. And there were movements that galvanized around those ideologies and that resulted in massive changes to the world as we knew it in the 20th century. I'm here to share with you that I do not believe there is an alternative grand narrative now to capitalism, and if there is, it's called globalization, which is an extension of capitalism in my perspective. So, what does that mean from an equity perspective, which is something that's really important to me as the Dean of a College of Education at the University of Denver, with a motto that's the great private institution dedicated to the public good. Well, it means that education is, in my view, now the vehicle for progressive rights-based reform in the 21st century. And I'm going to make a case for it. Why would I say that? Well, one, it's the most politically and socially palatable solution to address inequity globally without threatening the hegemonic order. Meaning that I have never, ever seen a politician or a president or a chancellor argue against the value of education. Maybe actually there are instances of it. But I've never seen it happen in a way that people would galvanize around that notion that they were anti-education. All right? That's the first assumption I'm making. The second is that education is inextricably linked to economic development, especially in the era of globalization and what people sometimes call the new knowledge-based economy. Meaning that when we think about the world and how it's changed, and we think about the impact of technology, for example, which I'll discuss a little later, you really can't talk about technology without talking about education and educational institutions. And the last is that education is based on a hierarchical system of delivery. You have grades, elementary or primary levels, middle versus secondary or post-secondary. And this allows for targeted interventions. And I think that's a really important aspect of what I'm trying to convey to you. If we no longer have grand narratives or alternatives to capitalism, one of the ways in which we now intervene from an equity perspective is looking at the educational system en masse, but not always intervening involving the whole educational system. What I find interesting about UNESCO or United Nations resolutions is often they decide educational reform is somewhat of a pendulum swing. What you'll see is that there's an emphasis on K through 12, and then there's an emphasis on higher ed, and then there's an emphasis on pre-K. And what you get is, in different times, different kinds of intervention strategies. So those are the three reasons why I believe that education is the vehicle that I've mentioned now. Let me now talk about the impact of conflicts and emergencies. And again, we have esteemed panelists who can talk about this much more in depth and with greater expertise than myself. But I do want to lay out, again, some general sort of concepts to think about. In the real world, all right, the best laid plans of the thing that I just said, meaning that education is a vehicle for progressive change, gets undermined constantly with the unpredictable nature of the world. And by that I mean war, ideological and religious conflicts, natural disasters, financial crises, etc. All of which take the gleam or the shine of the aspirations and the hopes surrounding educational reform and really put it in a context that's real. So let's look at some examples. The devastation of war in Iraq and Afghanistan, obviously. Plus, for example, the horrifying effect of the earthquake in Haiti. The consequences of the HIV and AIDS pandemic in sub-Saharan South Africa, or Africa, I should say. All of these basically say that it's wonderful to tout education as the vehicle for which equity now will bloom. But the reality of what it's like to live in this world means that the educational system often, and you're sort of just point out to it, what happens when you add all of those things together is a diminishing of outcomes, stunted opportunities, and broken systems. And that will take generations to overcome what then become cumulative disadvantages. Right? So everyone loves to talk about the impact, the progressive, positive impact of education, but in the real world, based on the things that happen to human beings, in nation states, in regions, the reality is that the educational system really isn't a magic pill. It's not a panacea that will solve all ills in our society, even though often it's presented that way. Again, I don't think I'm saying anything that's too controversial. I hope I'm not, but if I am, great. Let's talk a little bit about persistent inequalities and educational contradictions. I was someone that, I'm a sociologist, and so I find it often strange that I ended up being a dean of a college of education. It wasn't actually in my mindset. It wasn't something I thought that I would end up doing, but I was always writing about education, so it kind of always pushed me towards what I was naturally, I guess, meant to do. But I love the notion of contradiction. I love looking at contradiction as a way of understanding the world. So we have these persistent inequalities, and they probably actually, not probably, they have grown worse. Class, socioeconomic status, race and ethnicity, gender, religion, language, and there are many more, that produce what we often call in sociology unintended consequences or outcomes. So I'm going to share three with you. How many of you saw Argo? I thought that movie was really fascinating for a bunch of reasons. One, because actually Ben Affleck made a good film. In itself was a miracle. But seriously, because for those of you that have studied the revolution, and that should be in Iran, not Iraq, I mean, what you found is that there was a movement funded by the United States and other developed countries focused on education and building an educational system that was a world-class educational system that would move folks towards a secular worldview. And the unintended consequence was they were a major stakeholder, constituency group that led revolution. And that brought the country back to a militant Islamic state. That is an unintended consequence that I'm pretty sure the CIA didn't think would be the outcome. So there's a contradiction. Or here's another one. Highly gendered societies and petroleum-rich countries producing massive educational gains for women in underrepresented fields. The sciences. Who would have predicted that? All right? Or black male initiatives in the United States. And who are their main competitors? Access to the prison industrial complex. In fact, in this country, in key states where the minority or the majority, you're more likely in some cities like New York and other large urban areas to gain access to the prison industrial complex than you are to the public university systems. All right? So the world never seems to cooperate with the ways in which us as experts claim they will. And I think that's really important. I'll come back to that in my last little section. So I was asked to talk about future innovations, possible opportunities. And, you know, I'm a little weary of the magic pill. I've mentioned it already. The one that I hear all the time in educational forum is technology. Technology is going to revolutionize everything. Technology is going to solve all the social ills that we have and all the problems in the educational system. Well, my view is great technology coupled with bad pedagogy is bad learning, okay? So I'm not necessarily convinced that that's the case, but I do think that there are obviously ways in which we can look at technology, and there are many things. I'm part of the Global Cities Symposium and an initiative that's funded by the Gates Foundation and the Asia Society, and Denver's one of the cities that participates in Singapore, Melbourne, Toronto. It's actually pretty interesting. And technology is being used in a variety of ways to really transform education. But the reality is that it's only one way in which we have to engage in educational reform. So I would just cast some doubt on the notion that technology on its own is going to solve all that ill that faces the educational system. Some of the other things that I'm concerned about is the ways in which, if you look at the educational system, right, people don't understand, and if you think about it from the point of view of a university, I've always argued that universities are the most conservative or traditional institutions in society. Now, what's interesting is if you talk to folks that criticize universities and colleges, they often say that they're the most liberal institutions, progressive institutions in society. But what I mean by tradition is that universities are very adverse to change. They're very resistant to alter the ways in which they do things. Well, the educational system more generally is the same. It's extremely difficult to have systemic change in the educational system. Well, why? Because they're governed by policies. They're local, they're state or provincial or federal policies. They're vested interest in terms of stakeholders. If you think about this university, this is a fairly selective institution. Well, selective institutions have a relationship to vested stakeholders. I mean, people can talk all they want about folks not needing higher education, but you don't see families from elite backgrounds that tell their children not to receive an elite education. So there's something to be said about the status, the prestige, and the value attached to an elite education. And then, of course, there are varying levels of investments at the local level, at the national level, and at the regional level that generate different outcomes with respect to success for educational systems. So what about the private sector or private-public partnerships as an innovation? I think there's a real opportunity, and I've seen it often, where you can have real important progressive outcomes with a public-private sector merger or some sort of partnership. But there are a couple of things that I'd like to raise as caveats. One, the mission of that merger or that partnership has to be clearly defined. All right? Meaning that one of the things about education that's so critical is it's a public good mission. When you merge with a private sector entity, you have to make it clear that the profit margin is not the mission, that the mission is a public good mission. That doesn't mean that it is impossible to generate profit. It just means that it cannot be the primary undergirding reason why there's a partnership. And I say that because I have lots of examples in my college where the mission is always blurred and we're never really honest with each other about what we're doing. All right? What about competition? This is something I hear all the time, and you're seeing it in the United States. The last great public monopoly in the United States is the educational system. All right? Whether you want to talk about it in terms of teachers' unions, whether you want to talk about it in terms of colleges and schools of education. So why don't we generate more competition in the system, let people compete for resources and the best outcomes for them? That's wonderful, again, if the mission is to improve overall education. If the mission is to generate more opportunities for profit, then we have a contradiction. It's an interesting contradiction, but it's also a damaging contradiction. So I would say that it really depends, and this is something in the United States that we're struggling with, on the role of the state. I find it really interesting that all of the discussions we have about educational reform in the United States rarely focus on the role of the federal government, because if you look at the Constitution, there really isn't anything about education as a fundamental right, or the federal government is being responsible for education, right? Yet, what I want to point out is if you think about research, and we're a university and policy reform, one of the things that I find really interesting about what universities and colleges can do, but what they're not doing, is they're not asking the hard questions. They're not looking at data that's now become very popular. So we have a lot of international data to look at educational outcomes. And you hear people in the United States constantly complaining, well, we can't compete. We can't compete with Singapore, or we can't compete with China, or we can't compete, and they point to TIMSS, PISA, OECD data, right? But I find this to be very ahistorical, and if it were acontextual, in the sense that they don't talk about the entire society that they're comparing themselves to. So here's an example, all right? There are many innovations in the Indian educational system in India. How many of you want to live in a society with that kind of Gini coefficient in terms of inequality, right? So we're all up in arms that they're producing all these engineers, all these scientists, but we don't talk about the other aspects of the society, right? Things that you study that somehow then become immune from a discussion and a comparison. So that's one thing that really concerns me, okay? A lot of the other things are the role of the state, the extent to which we make investments in education and we get good outcomes. So Finland, everyone talks about how wonderful the Finnish educational system is and how particularly excellent the Finnish teachers are, right? Finland teachers are exceptionally good. And you know what's interesting about the educational system in Finland and higher ed is that the best, most qualified students go into education. That is not the case in this society, in the United States, and in other industrial countries or developed countries, right? Well, in Finland, they pay their teachers upwards of $125,000, $150,000 a year. They treat their teachers and accord them the respect of change agents, of folks that are some of the leaders in society. So the outcomes are different, but we don't talk about that when we bash teachers in the United States, right? The average teacher in Colorado, when they start, will make somewhere between $30,000 and $37,000 a year. All right? So when we get all up in arms and all foamed up about international comparisons, oh my God, the United States is going down the drain. It'd be wonderful to actually look at the entire society we're comparing to. So I've raised these issues with you because I know that I'm certainly not going to do justice to all the wonderful things and actually some of the frightening things that our panelists are going to talk about. But I do want to frame some of these larger debates that often get lost when we talk about education. Everybody wants to talk about the positive, aspirational aspects of education, but we have to talk about its limits. And if we don't talk about its limits, this year's wonderful solution will be next year's problem, and then we'll be talking about something else, technology or something else, right? And so I'd like you to think critically, over the course of the next couple of days about what our panelists and what the participants are going to be talking to you about. Because to me, education is probably the most important vehicle, but not on its own, and certainly not without mobilization. If you look at the history of the 20th century, and I'm going to stop in a second. If you look at the history of the 20th century, you'll find that civil society, often some of the most radical components and progressive changes occurred through institutions of civil society, schools and universities being two of the primary institutions, churches. My parents are from South Africa. If you look at the litany of civil society institutions that changed, that brought down apartheid, they were the churches, they were the schools, they were the universities, they were legal and civil associations, right? These are the vehicles for social change, but they require contestation and mobilization, right? And when I look at the United States right now, where's the mobilization coming from? The Occupy movement is interesting, but what's the agenda of the Occupy movement? When I started this discussion by saying there are no more grand narratives, the one advantage of having a grand narrative is you always recognize there was an enemy. There was some force, something you went towards to change. What are we going towards now to change? That, to me, is one of the biggest challenges of global education. Thank you. And I'd love to talk, if you have questions, it'd be wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you, Dean Anderson, for those very insightful remarks, and thank you as well for keeping well under time. Fabulous.
I cede my time to the panel.
Well, now we're going to cede your time to the floor and take questions. So now we're going to take a moment now before we engage with our other panelists. We're going to open the session up to the floor and take questions from you all for about 10 minutes. So please, if you have questions, feel free to ask them to Dean Anderson.
Or not.
Or not. Or do.
Thank you all very much for being here today. I wanted to kind of pose one of your own questions back to you in terms of, I know that this will be contextually different depending on where we're talking about, but with your experience in education in America, what do you think the role of the federal government is in education?
Well, I think it needs to be far more proactive. I think we finally have to come to terms with the fact that devolving responsibility onto in terms of local control or states' rights don't generate the kind of outcomes that the country wants. So I believe it has to be far more proactive. I believe it also has to be funded. Has to be a funded mandate. The problem with that is that we do have an interventionist federal government. And right now, the Obama administration is deeply involved in educational reform. From my perspective, they're far too technocratic in the approach that they're taking, meaning that they're driving a lot of data-driven solutions. And you know, I didn't talk about it, but it was in the slide. The data-driven solutions, unfortunately, are not addressing the human components of what it is to be an excellent teacher or to be a successful student. And now we're kind of shortcutting to a long-term solution because we're not addressing the resource issues, the way that we distribute resources based on property values or based on government, or governor or mayoral budgets. And instead, we're looking for outcomes without, and we're moving quickly towards outcomes without thinking about the contradictions and the unintended consequences. And I'll mention one. How many of you are familiar with what's going on in Atlanta? All right. Do you want to share with the?
Oh, I think you would probably explain it much better.
Well, there's a massive cheating controversy scandal in Atlanta, and it's really driven by this focus on standardized test scores. And we're having the same thing happening in Colorado. We have Senate Bill 191 that generates a link between student achievement data and educators. The educators have an ID number. And then we can link it to class and school level and district data. And if the students perform poorly on standardized test scores, now there are other variables, but they're still working them out. Right now, the only one we have really are standardized test scores. Thankfully, Colorado has a growth strategy so that you can look at growth as well. But what that means is that it's forcing teachers to teach to the test, and it's forcing some school districts to actually cheat. And I predicted this that was going to happen in 2001, you know, like Nostradamus, no one listened. But that's an unintended consequence of the movement, this technocratic solution to just sort of say, well, if we have excellent outcomes, that's enough. Well, what is an excellent learning outcome? That's the big question to me. Those are difficult questions to answer. They're not just technocratic questions. You know, often the best experiences I've had as a professor or as a teacher come from a student that I haven't heard from in 15 years, and I'm dating myself, but that write to me and then say, you know, I didn't understand what the hell you were talking about back then, but in reflection, you've really changed my life. And when that happens, is that a learning outcome? Yes. I remember that student. The fact that that student is actually not in prison right now is quite amazing to me. But how am I going to measure that with a standardized test?
So I agree with you that it's very difficult to make global comparisons and that you need to be cautious when making them and you need to look at the context of the situation. But if globalization is to be the next big political scheme, capitalism as an extension of that, then where is the U.S. education system in the global scheme and how do we benefit from that and from working either in partnership or in competition with other global education?
I think that comparisons are critical. I mean, I don't think you can have significant educational reform that's place-based in any place, in any country, in any nation state, in any region, without rigorous comparisons. The question that I was raising was, all right, you look at the concept of globalization. The concept of globalization is based on the notion that we have, in the 20th century, had a mass production model, right? We made things, okay? And if you're a Marxist, then you believe that the labor power embedded in the labor really generated profit. Well, in the globalized economy, you have 75 flavors of ice cream, right? And it's the differentiation in the market and the consumer's choice that's driving the economic engine. But my question is to all of you, who's producing all of this? There are still producers in the world, and they're getting paid a pittance. They have nothing to do with education. So if we're going to make the comparison about the drive towards excellence, we have to talk about it from a global perspective. We have to talk about the fact that the iPad that my daughter loves and that I love too, all right, comes at a cost in terms of labor. We have to talk about that, and that has nothing to do with whether we have a shortage of engineers, right? So it's not as simple as the way that the debate is being driven. So I absolutely believe in comparisons, but to me they have to be meaningful comparisons. And they also have to have a humanistic quality that we're just losing. We're moving to a technocratic world in which if I say that the outcome is X and I make that outcome, then that's a good public gain. Well, is it a good public gain if there has no social value? I mean, I always say to people, why is it that we pay paramedics nothing, but we pay professional athletes all this money? Who would you rather have James beside you in the ambulance trying to revive you with a heart attack, or a qualified paramedic? At that point, who do you value more? All right? So what's driving the choices we make and the ways that we attribute values to it? It may seem simplistic, but I think we've lost that critical question.
Question over here. Yeah.
So do you think that the global education models could benefit from more localized models that focus on empowerment and agency, such as like Freire's points of view?
Yeah, I mean, I do. I think that the pedagogy of the oppressed, in which, for those of you that know Paulo Freire, the way that they use the lived context to teach literacy is an incredibly important example of engagement to generate educational outcomes, right? I think what's happened, though, is we have this tendency to focus. In educational reform, we have this pendulum swing going on. And what happens is we focus on one thing, we have a huge debate about that one thing, and then we discard it and we go completely to the other direction, right? So my big concern about the technocratic thing that's happening in the United States is that the community and the community engagement piece that's so central to being an effective teacher. So for example, what we're trying to do in the College of Education is we're trying to actually prepare teachers differently than we ever have before. They do need to know technology. They can't be fearful of technology. They do need to know how to do research, action research, qualitative, quantitative research. They need to know how to counsel students. They need to know how to work with children and families. They need to know about response to intervention, right? They need to know about the importance of libraries as one of the community hubs for literacy in this country. Most low-income families access the internet through the public libraries. They do their resumes and CVs through the public libraries. So we need kind of a renaissance in terms of education. And that would involve the Freirean model. The problem is, again, we're being pushed towards outcomes. It's we're outcomes-driven society. And that's what I have against the OECD, the TIMSS, and the PISA. Outcomes for what purpose? We have to ask that question, and Freire asked that question all the time. So absolutely. The problem with Freire now, though, is that he's dead, unfortunately. And it seems that was part of a liberation movement that we've discarded with, it's now in the garbage bin of history. I'm not saying I believe that, but I'm saying that a lot of people do.
Okay, going over here. Okay, yeah.
So my question's about the idea of public-private partnerships in education. And you had opened up talking about how capitalism is really our only bet left. But you also used the example of social democracies like Finland, the success that they have. And so really my question is, can you think of any examples where public-private partnership has led to greater equity rather than less?
Yeah, not always in the educational sphere, because I think the educational sphere is very divisive. Right now, the private sector is often getting involved in educational reform because they really honestly have a beef with teachers' unions, and they want to get rid of them. I mean, you know, if you get them drunk, they'll tell you that. But they won't tell you that unless they're drunk. Where there are great public-private sector, it's in the area of community engagement. So there are nonprofit organizations that are embedded in place-based areas, that own restaurants, that educate, that provide scholarships for students. And they're not owned by the nonprofit, they're owned by the community, that are generating workforce development opportunities, that are partnering with community colleges, that are partnering with middle schools and secondary schools, that are partnering with industry in the area. Those are examples that I see that are positive, but it requires a real sober, pardon the drunk part before, a real sober analysis of what our interests. Why are we doing this, right? Why are we merging? What are our interests, and how our interests align? What are our assets? What are our partners' assets? And where do we draw a line where we say, okay, we need an objective party that says we're now moving away from our mission. We're now, you know, because what happens when you're successful is your successes get appropriated. That could be a good thing or a bad thing, right? You know, it's when I stated capitalism, I'm not opposed to it, and even if I was, who cares? We have it, right? It's not like me being opposed to it's going to mean anything. I still got to ride my car, which I bought, you know, and stuff like that. But I am saying that we haven't we haven't really thought strategically, intentionally about public partnerships in education, right? I'll give you one example and then I'll stop. And you look at the movement to digitalization. You look at the fact that one day, you know, the librarians in my college are crying every day because they know one day books. I love books. I just like looking at them. I don't read them all the time. I just look at them, right? But you look at what's happening in the educational industry around books, around textbooks, and the whole debate and fight over open source content right now. It's being reappropriated by the big publishing firms, right? And all the open source content areas and the kind of initiatives are now being kind of pulled back into a private sector mode that is anathema to why they actually started open source content to begin with. So it is a battle and a conflict. And what I would end with is the only way that a public-private sector partnership works well is if there are folks that are overseeing it that are mobilized, like you all, in groups, that are watchdogs, that hold folks accountable to the stated mission. I feel that's the only way we're really going to have that. That can happen through a bunch of things. It can happen through a government entity. It can happen through civil society organizations and institutions. But it has to happen somewhere because down the line, things change over time. And you have to be able to say that's moving away from what our original intent was. And that needs some force. That you have to compel folks to do that.
One other question?
One
Professor
question,
Destray.
going with the public-private, I was wondering if you could comment, because the public-private conversation, I think, is often confused with the emergence of for-profit universities and colleges, which are, so say that they engage in unfortunate and often really predatory practices aimed at a class of people that they can exploit. I think I got all the key buzzwords in there. I think has also changed a lot of our thinking about that kind of thinking between the public and private sector. And I think, you know, whether you're technically a private university or public university or profit universities, and it's a whole different universe that has emerged, bombarded every night on television commercials. Right?
I agree. I mean, I think I might have mentioned it the last time I spoke here to court. There was an ex-president, well, he's a former president, he's now passed away, that said something I'll never forget. He said that businesses seep into the dysfunctional cracks of public systems. And essentially what we've seen in higher ed is you have a demand. What is the demand for education? It's the aspirational demand to improve your life chances. Who would be opposed to that, right? But you have systems that are not functioning in an equitable way or in an efficient way. And then you have folks that enter into that system taking advantage of the demand. But remember, what is the ultimate goal? And then what happens is they exploit the demand. So in the United States only, the for-profits are becoming the primary institutional site for low-income students of color seeking access to their dream, so that taking advantage of that opportunity, right? And yet, we have all these predatory loans, which weren't monitored by a strong federal government. They're trying now. The states also don't have legislation that properly monitors it, so you have folks moving sort of predatorily from state to state, all right, taking advantage of something that actually is quite shameful. It really is the primary mission of education is to educate everyone, not those that can afford it, and to provide them with a quality education. So that is what's happening, and I fear that with respect to technology, and then I'll end, that the technology sort of magic pill is also connected to that predatorial capacity, all right? Meaning that everybody wants the quick solution for the demand. We all want it, but we're not thinking about the unintended contradictory consequences, and that's one of them right there. I mean, if you look at data involving predatory loans in this society, it's pretty abysmal. And you have strong lobbying groups that are stopping changes in this country from taking place to protect the consumer. The consumer, in this instance, is the student.
Great, thanks. I think we're out of time for questions. Thank you, Dean Anderson, for your very insightful remarks. I think you did a great job of setting the stage for our panel to come, framing some of the larger issues and limitations of education, especially I think we're going to find now in areas of conflict, post-conflict, and refugee areas. So thank you very much for that. Unfortunately, Dean Anderson has to leave us shortly because there's another engagement. However, he is here on campus, so I'm sure he will be happy to answer all kinds of questions in the future. So again, thank you, Dean Anderson.
Thank you.
Okay, now we're going to move on to the panelists. Our format will be that each panelist will have 20 minutes for their remarks, and then after the three of them go, we will have a Q&A session where you can put all your questions to them. And so with that, I'd like to start with our panel. We're going to start with Shakir Ishaq. Mr. Ishaq, thank you.
I didn't see a word yet.
That's counting as part of your time.
I think this mic should be. Yeah, okay, it's working. Good evening. It's my great pleasure to be here. A piece of advice: be careful before your speech when you talk to your moderator. They just come and announce everything. Before talking about our work in the conflict areas, I would just like to give you a brief overview of the organization BFAIR. BFAIR, or Basic Education for Afghan Refugees, started off as a bilateral project between the Pakistani and the German governments for sustainable development and basic education for Afghan refugees in Pakistan. It was transformed into an independent national NGO in 2003, which broadened its horizon and scope. BFAIR as a project and later as an organization has over 2 decades of experience working in the Northwest Frontier Province and federally administered tribal areas of Pakistan. And more recently in the provinces of Punjab, Sindh, and Balochistan. Today we have a staff strength of around 1,300 people working through 11 sub-offices all over the country. BFAIR has worked with governmental departments at all levels, and when I say all levels, we mean national, provincial, districts, union councils, to successfully implement multi-sectoral programs in education, vocational skills training, health awareness, mother and child health, improved child health programs, governance, devolution support, curtailing human smuggling and trafficking, energy conservation, democratization, alternate energy, and conducting large-scale surveys and baseline studies. This map shows our presence in different parts of Pakistan. BFAIR has worked with a large number of donors as shown on the screen. These include the UNHCR, the World Bank, BPRM, European Commission, ILO, USAID, UNICEF, UNESCO, and many others. Our goal is to successfully promote institutional cooperation for sustainable social and economic development. Our objective is to improve and contribute towards better living standards of the marginalized, displaced, and the underprivileged communities through interventions such as quality education, vocational and skills training, health awareness, microfinance, enterprise development, poverty alleviation, and socioeconomic development initiatives. We believe that education is a fundamental human right and vital to lasting positive change in children's lives. It is critical to our development as individuals and as societies. We ensure that children have access to right-based quality education that is rooted in gender equality. Education stops generational cycles of poverty and disease and provides a foundation for sustainable development. Acquiring knowledge is obligatory for every Muslim man and woman, were the sayings of the Holy Prophet of Islam. On the contrary, today some miscreant forces and non-state actors claiming to be the Islamists are preaching exactly the opposite, depriving many children of their basic right of access to education. These violent elements have been playing havoc in countries like Pakistan and Afghanistan. In recent years, the activities of these elements have resulted in blowing up of schools, killing of teachers, abduction of NGO officials associated with imparting education, and last but not the least, shooting students who just want to get a proper education. You have obviously all heard of Malala Yousafzai, the little girl from Swat in Pakistan, who was shot by the Taliban only because she raised her voice for her right to have access to education. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the late 70s resulted in the influx of over 3 million refugees into Pakistan, mostly into the border province of NWFP, now called KPK or Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. It was initially Northwest Frontier Province, so they localized the name and changed it to KPK. The refugees and their hosting country were new to this, and both were facing great difficulties in coping with the situation. Lack of resources as well as the expertise created a scenario where international support was required. The international community also responded with great enthusiasm and started contributing to provide shelters, food, water, and health care to the arriving refugees. With millions of hungry and hundreds of thousands of sick, there was a very low priority for education in the initial days. The UN Refugees Agency, UNHCR, started providing support for establishment of primary schools in refugee camps, where the financial support was being provided by the UNHCR, whereas operational and administrative support was the responsibility of the government of Pakistan. However, there was still a large number of refugee children and adolescents who lost several years of education resulting from the war inside Afghanistan and later due to their movement inside Pakistan. They were not of proper age to enroll into a formal school and were left out. The Pakistan and German government, through a bilateral agreement, initiated a project called GTZ BFAIR in the early 90s to initiate non-formal education courses to bring in the out-of-school children into the education system. In 1996, the UNHCR handed over the responsibility of managing its formal education system to BFAIR through a project named Community Oriented Primary Education, or COPE in short. BFAIR strived to increase school enrollments and brought many out-of-school children into the education system. Those who never had access to education or had to drop out of the education system and were not of proper age to enroll into a formal school were given an opportunity to enroll into the non-formal education schools, and through an accelerated homeschool program were able to join the formal education system after completing 5 years of education in 2.5 years. BFAIR managed to increase the school enrollment from around 62,000 in 1996 to approximately 114,000 in 2004. Additional donors came on board to support this project, making it the largest refugee education project worldwide. But by then, 9/11 had already happened and plans were underway to close down many camps on pretext of being a security threat. This also meant closure of all the schools in these camps, resulting in a rapid decline in BFAIR school enrollment from 114,000 to around 76,000. And you can see around 2005, when the camps closed, the children had to leave the school. And nobody ever went back to check where these kids went. The operators of humanitarian assistance in the field and in the offices now faced increased threats. Threats were to the assets, which included theft and damage during transit or at stations, to the humanitarian assistance staff, who were threatened in way of abduction, killing, or injury, and in some cases also to the beneficiaries for accepting assistance from international donors. The rapidly changing scenario posed new challenges, which included difficulty for donors to plan activities in unstable areas, difficulty in resource allocation by the implementing partners due to volatility of the ground situation, damage to the infrastructure of schools, high teachers turnover due to security risk and hence lack of trained teachers, high cost of education due to additional security measures, dropout of female students due to unsafe mobility, inadequate government support to provide security for promotion of education and support to donor agencies. For children who were already refugees, additional security threat and exposure to natural calamities made the situation more complex. The community's confidence in services of humanitarian actors had diminished and needed to be restored. Parents were reluctant to send their children to schools which were providing less than the basic facilities, and they did not feel it was worth taking the risk of exposing their children to unnecessary threat. The children who were exposed to multiple traumas had very little interest in education. The situation was complex and a multi-pronged approach was required to overcome the challenges. It was felt that the atmosphere in the schools need to be significantly improved to make it more children-friendly. Although the communities were already involved in the school activities, it needed further enhancement. With limited resources from the UNHCR to meet the ever-increasing needs, BFAIR approached new and non-traditional donors. And when I say non-traditional, I mean those who do not specifically work for the refugees, such as UNHCR or BPRM, but are otherwise providing assistance wherever needed. BFAIR signed an MOU with the Japanese NGO, which had access to Japanese government funding, and together made good progress in significantly improving the school environment. An aggressive advocacy campaign was also launched to encourage girls to attend the schools, some of whom had started to stay away in wake of threats by the militants against females going out of their homes, especially for education. BFAIR started engaging closely with the security agencies and the intelligence agencies of Pakistan to have constant access to emerging situations in its area of work. Special precautions were taken to ensure that the staff visiting the field follow the local dress code. A special focus was also needed to increase the number of extracurricular activities, which are not only significant in child development but also help in generating children's interest in the school and community involvement in the school activities. A great deal of emphasis was also placed in the selection of teaching staff, which represented a good mix of refugees and people from the hosting communities. This provided a comfortable space for coexistence and helped in mitigating the resentment in the hosting communities towards the refugee population, which has always been the recipients of international assistance. This has often resulted in hostilities towards the refugee population. And the fear was that the long-standing resentment may surface in the rapidly changing hostile environment. And last but not the least, additional security measures had to be taken, such as irregular movement in the field and restricted use of marked vehicles in order to avoid any untoward situation. Except for the incident where I was abducted myself, thankfully we have not had any bad situation in the field. But I was very visible, so they had to come after me. And I don't give up my word. That's the bad thing. Taking these necessary steps enabled BFAIR to still achieve some milestones. We continue managing 127 schools with around 57,000 students today. Out of these, 68 are for boys, 35 are for girls, and 24 are co-education schools. The reason I'm showing you all these slides is to give you an idea what kind of condition we have in our schools. You see the children sitting on the floors in many schools. There was a slight decline in the percentage of our female enrollment, which had risen to a level of around 31% at one stage, was now decreased to around 27%. It kept fluctuating, it has always been tricky, but currently it's around 27%. Teachers from BFAIR schools are providing trainings to be able to deal with the changing security environment. There is a concept we call MOPSIS, it's Management of Primary Schools Under Stress. So the teachers were providing trainings on MOPSIS. We obviously continued to publish and started focusing on development of material for promoting gender equality in peace education. You can see some of our publications here. Besides formal education, BFAIR continued to add to the numbers of its non-formal education course graduates, which now stands at around 71,000 students from our adult literacy course, over 82,000 from our mother and child health program, 31,000 from accelerated homeschool program, and around 10,000 for integrated adult literacy program with vocational skills and training. Extracurricular activities, as I said earlier, were given significant importance and were increasing the school to make the environment pleasant as well as more involving for the students. These activities are vital for child's development and also helpful in keeping the child's delicate mind free of violent thoughts and activities. We ensure that the parents and the community elders attend the events to encourage the children and also to inculcate a sense of ownership amongst the communities. BFAIR senior management also gets directly involved into these activities to show its commitments to the cause of education and well-being of the children. And you can see I'm hugging a child there. He stood first in the educational competition. Normally, the senior management, like everywhere else, is working at the policy level. But just to show our commitment and to tell them how important it is for us also, we get involved at the activity level also. Engaging with new donors also improved the school's environment, where new classrooms were constructed. Children were provided with new school bags, pencil boxes, and other supplies. Health and hygiene kits were distributed amongst the students. New uniforms were provided with the support from Qatar Foundation. Furniture was provided for senior classes in order to encourage retention into higher grades. And sports equipment along with sports teachers were provided to the schools. As a result, we have seen a significant improvement in the enthusiasm levels of the students as well as their parents. Based on our experience in dealing with uncertain and volatile situations, we suggest that in order to improve the outcomes of educational interventions, we need to continue strengthening an environment of mutual trust between the service providers and end beneficiaries. Ownership of the intervention by the communities need to be encouraged. Winning the goodwill and trust of the elders and influential within the target communities through working with the communities and respecting the socio-cultural norms of the communities. Focusing on service delivery through local organizations and improve monitoring through applications of participatory monitoring and evaluation tools. Improvement in service delivery through additional activities complementing the educational interventions. And finally, continue to strive towards providing a more child-friendly environment in the schools, which is conducive for learning. Thank you very much. I was told by the moderator that you can ask me questions later on, so I won't be able to answer it.
Thank you, Mr. Shock, for assisting in answering questions for the moment. Great. So our next speaker is going to be Ms. Amy Rhodes.
So we're not 100% sure if the clicker works with the Prezi. We're going to check whether these inputs.
It's I've got to download Adobe plugin for it.
I think downloading will take a while, so maybe I have it on me.
Okay, yeah, let me. We can
Looks great.
Yeah.
Eyes open?
Okay.
Kelly, can you go in your bag and grab the Mac?
While we're getting those ready, I just want to take this opportunity to remind everybody. First of all, I'm Annie Rothel. I'm the Associate Director for the Center on Rights Development. Just take a moment to remind you that we wanted to create opportunities for you to really have access with our speakers tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. in the Cyber Cafe, I believe, or is it 301? Cyber Cafe, thank you. Yeah, it's in your schedule. Sorry, a few last room changes. Maria Jessup will be joining us to do professional in residence, so you can come and have some more time with her one-on-one to really get to know more about her career path and how she got to where she's going. And then tomorrow we still have a few spaces left for our 12 o'clock workshop with Amy in 301, and she's going to be doing a workshop called Rebuilding Lives and Livelihoods, and about doing sustainable education development in Haiti and other developing countries. So we have both of those opportunities tomorrow, as well as our evening panel tomorrow night, which will be in the Cyber Cafe at 6 o'clock. We'll be talking about doing inequalities, gaps and gains, educational inequalities in U.S. education, so we'll get a little more domestic focus. And then on Thursday at noon, we have two of our speakers that will be joining us on Thursday evening. We have Cream Wright, who's going to be here, and we also have Amy, who will still be with us, who are going to do another professional in residence, so you can have time again to speak with them and find out more about their career paths and how they got to where they're going, and really drill them with questions you may have about their organizations and their past. And then we'll be closing with our panel at 6 p.m. on Thursday. That panel is going to be the futures of education innovation. And so we hope that you can continue to join us for more symposium events. There's more information about our speakers and our events, and we actually will have videos of all of our presentations soon. Don't run home and hope tonight that they're all uploaded. These take some time. On our website at www.centeronrightsdevelopment.org. So I think there's some more beverages and snacks in the back.
Yeah, we're going to have Maria present, and she and I are going to work on this and get it squared away.
Fantastic. We haven't done the futures of education with the technology until Thursday. That's why it isn't working out yet. So yes, just thank you for attending again, even in the inclement weather. We appreciate you being here.
Michael.
And yeah.
So we're going to do a slight change in our ordering. We're going to have Maria and Jessup go to some slight technical issues. We'll be back after these messages. So, thanks very much, Maria.
My pleasure. Let's see, I can keep my fingers from sliding off this podium. All right. Nice to see you all. I want you to know that I left 70-degree weather in Washington, D.C. and cherry blossoms in full bloom to be greeted by a blizzard in Denver. But you're a pretty warm crowd, so I'll forgive you. So I want to just start by telling you a little bit about USIP, U.S. Institute of Peace. We've been around for almost 30 years. We were established by the U.S. Congress. And our mission is to help prevent and resolve international conflict through nonviolent means. And we do this through a number of vehicles. We have grants program, and we fund organizations similar to the one that you just heard about in various conflict zones. And we also fund research on topics related to peace building. And we also have a Rule of Law Center. We have an academy, which is the department I'm with. And we're the training and education arm of the Institute. So we do a lot of training and education both at our headquarters in Washington, D.C., as well as in conflict zones. Our mandate is to work on international conflicts, so we don't really focus on the domestic side. But I encourage you to check us out at www.usip.org. And if you were interested in working more and getting more education on conflict resolution and peace building, it's a good resource because we have a lot of practitioners that come to our courses there. So my history, I was hired by USIP in late 2007, and I was brought on specifically to work on Iraq and Iraq education sector projects, and specifically on civic education and human rights education. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my experiences on two projects. One was developing peace and human rights educators working with Iraqi academics. And then another one, which was a civic education project working with the Ministry of Education in Baghdad, but also in coordination with the Ministry of Education in Kurdistan, that is a regional autonomous government and has its own Ministry of Education. But before I get into talking a little bit about the specifics of those projects, well, first I'll just tell you briefly what we achieved with those projects. My objective tonight is not really to tell you about all the specifics of our projects, but really to talk to you more about the process that I went through as a practitioner going to Iraq, and how I sort of made decisions about how to go about doing this work in very challenging circumstances. It's not easy being a peace builder in a country that your government is occupying, military occupant invaded, right? It's a little bit of a contradiction in terms, okay? So I had to wrestle with this quite a bit. And so I really want to tell you a little bit about my background and my sort of the lens through which I was viewing this situation, and then how I proceeded. And I'm sure I'm going to run out of time, but you can show up tomorrow at 9 for more. So I'm a practitioner, I was a mediator, you heard a little bit about my background. There are different ways of viewing the world of peace building, and it's one of the fields that has become more crowded in the last 10, 15 years. More people have gotten involved, and not everybody has a sort of the same definitions or ideas about what peace building is. I see this really, I'm an idealist, I see this as a very noble and creative and holistic endeavor. And it draws on all your experiences in life and all your faculties. Peace building draws on your intellectual, your spiritual, and your physical faculties, because it's also physically draining work. To me, peace building is associated with certain values, among them nonviolence, compassion, justice, human dignity, and service. And at its core, I think peace building and building peace is about building and rebuilding relationships at all levels. And the idea is to be working in conflict-affected societies. So we're talking about rebuilding these relationships between individuals, between groups, institutions, nations, within those groups and institutions. And it's fundamentally about making those relationships, I think, more just, respectful, harmonious, and collaborative. I mean, that's in essence where I'm coming from when I approach this. And I see education in all its forms and access to education as an essential means for building a more peaceful world. Your dean mentioned the idea about education being a vehicle for rights-based, reaching equity and rights-based approaches, and I think education is also an incredibly important entry point for peace building, because it is more palatable, as he mentioned, and it's a little less threatening, but although there's also skepticism and fear of outsiders being involved in education projects. And civic education, an American institution getting involved in a topic that was very sensitive in Iraq with a ministry organization, it was not an easy task. And we had to be very conscious of the approach that we took, because we found that we faced many obstacles. Not only the context and the insecure environment, just the devastation and the horrible challenges in the environment that people were in, but we also faced the challenge of our identity as a U.S. organization in that context. And so how do you deal with that? I mean, it was a mountain of challenges. Okay. So I also think that the education sector is is a very important area to focus on in peace building and deserves more attention, because you have a chance to impact so many more people and generations in the future. So it's very strategic, in my view, to focus on this sector. So let me tell you briefly about these two projects, and then I'm going to tell you sort of the process that I went through with the Human Rights Education Project. But the Human Rights Education Project was training Iraqi academics. They had come to us, they said, I've gone to Iraq on another project, and some academics from the University of Baghdad met with us, and they're saying, we have human rights education, we're teaching it, but the students don't seem to be buying it, and they're not really understanding why we're teaching it to them. And we want to know, they're saying to us, why are you teaching us about human rights? We don't have any. And so basically they were saying to the teachers, well, they wanted from us, how do you teach human rights in a way that actually changes attitudes and behaviors? They were teaching human rights in a very sort of traditional, lecture-oriented style, the way I'm doing right now. and it wasn't going over very well. And so that was the challenge that they had posed to us. And then on civic education, this was a priority. The education sector was devastated by the war, and also because of the sanctions and the first Gulf War and neglect over the years. And civic education was seen as a very important area to focus on, and the Minister of Education had identified this as a priority. So what we ended up doing was developing a civic education curriculum, but it was originally a curriculum project, but it ended up having, because for political reasons, we ended up switching to a teacher capacity building project. They said it's too sensitive for you to work on curriculum. We don't really want you to do that. So we sort of had to slowly kind of weave our way into advancing some modern ways of approaching civic education and doing the advancing these concepts, but doing it through this sort of side approach, which was teacher capacity building. And then, but what we ended up with, I won't give you all the details, but it took 4 years, but at the end they adopted it officially under their name. USIP's name is not on the curriculum. The Ministry of Education has adopted it. They printed it, they distributed it, they funded teacher training. So how did we get there is the question, right? And it took a long time. So there were significant results from that. So in early, how much time do I have left?
10 minutes.
Okay, all right. So early 2008 was when I started working on it, and I want to give you a little bit of the context. Iraq was experiencing violence on a daily basis. It still is a very violent place. The sectarian violence that reached its height in 2006 and 2007 had spilled over into university campuses, with over 300 academics having been assassinated over the previous year. Okay? Kidnappings for ransom and death threats were very common. Over 1,800 faculty members had fled central Iraq, mostly Baghdad, to safer areas in northern Kurdistan and outside Iraq. Countless more students also joined the exodus or remained in Iraq, but prisoners in their own homes, too fearful to make the trip to campus. So that was the context, okay? And as I mentioned, the education system had also undergone a prolonged period of decline. It was actually a pretty good system in the 60s and 70s. And it was, and it actually, under Saddam Hussein, one good thing is that he actually encouraged access to education for women, and in the region, women had better access to education in Iraq than a lot of other countries. So they had actually, the literacy rate was pretty good and all that. But again, the effect of the sanctions, the Gulf War, our invasion, and so forth, destroyed physically a lot of universities and schools, and also there was the de-Baathification program that involved in removing some of the administrators from universities. A lot of them were eventually put back in place, but just incredible. You can't overstate just the disruption and what happened. Other things that were going on, fraud in entrance examinations and other forms of corruption, motivated by sectarianism and discriminatory policies, that had sort of taken root in the university system. Teachers were paid ridiculously low salaries at that time. So trust between teacher and student was really bad. And when you think about the students as well, the kids that are in college today that are your age, right? All they've known, when you think about it, is war and sanctions, and now a fledgling democracy that is still marred by a lot of violence, and and a very repressive regime. So that's their mindset, and yet, so I asked myself in 2008, how would traumatized professors teach traumatized students about human rights in a country that had a legacy of massive human rights violations in a context as violent and insecure as Iraq, and in an education system where trust between student and teacher was so damaged. To me, it was like, how is this going to work, you know? And I was thinking about how is my U.S. identity going to play out here? There was also Abu Ghraib had happened, you know, like a year before, and it was still part of, you know, very much on people's minds. My expectation was that I'd have a huge credibility problem. And in the end, it didn't present as big an obstacle as I thought it would. You know, the academics who had been closed off from the outside world for so long, were actually, you know, very eager for knowledge, and they basically were open. They were a lot more open-minded than I would have been, you know, in the circumstances, I think. But nevertheless, I still took that context and that identity factor into consideration in designing the program. I believe that understanding the social context in which any kind of peace-building education program, whether it's human rights, civic education, peace, is crucial. It is the most important thing in order to be effective. And understanding that context and how, and not only what are the things that are supporting education, but also the things that are detracting from it. You have to also understand, I mean, I also think, you know, I also think of the legacy of colonialism and, you know, the mindsets that people are affected by in these contexts. And you're, you know, an American, you come from a privileged society. What kind of dynamic are you setting up? How do you mitigate against that sort of dynamic? Because if human rights education is fundamentally about empowerment, right? You know, how do you manage the power dynamics in the way in the process you use to go about designing your program and executing it? So some of the characteristics of the approach that I wanted to share with you is, these are some of the things that I sort of crystallized for myself that I think were important to our success with the Civic Education Project, and I mean, and to some extent with the Human Rights Education Project. One is that we were very opportunity focused, meaning that very often, you know, we're very problem oriented in Western society. We think about what we have to fix, right? All the things that are wrong. I mean, you look at Iraq, though, I mean, it's just overwhelming, right? Where do you start? What do you work on? And you have to, and I think that coming as a practitioner, you have to look at, you know, where is the will? And where is the will to work on something? And who are the people that are engaged and that care about something? And where there's a ripe opportunity. You know, these were academics who come to us and identify the issue. So people who are local people identify the issue as a priority, and there's a real will to do something about it. Okay, easy. Maybe four. Build off existing efforts, resources, and capabilities. I found out from my research, for instance, that in Iraq, you know, you think Saddam Hussein, dictatorship, what do they know about human rights education? But they had a pretty rich history of human rights education in the universities. They weren't teaching it, maybe they couldn't talk, they didn't have academic freedom, so they couldn't talk about their human rights situation in Iraq. But what they would do is they talk about other situations in other countries. And there was a wonderful academic, he's one of my heroes. He wrote this book, for instance, where he had a book where there were papers about human rights subjects that were very well researched in other subjects. And then he had a chapter on Iraq, and instead of doing a paper, he just had a polemical speech by Saddam Hussein. Well, that's what he did. That was his statement. Is that brilliant? I mean, it's totally brilliant, right? So there are creative ways that people, you know, got around it, and building on that and uplifting that and holding that up is so important, because you're talking about a society that has, has suffered so much devastation. You have to look for those pearls, and you have to uphold those. Client-centered. You have to be aware that this is not about you, it's about being of service, and that you have to have this sort of customer orientation and being of service, and making them see what is, how do we help, right? Being very relationship-centered. People in the Middle East are very, and much part of the world, are very oriented towards relationship. And so it's not just about getting the job done, it's about building relationships, and that's what peace building is. And one of the things that we did, for instance, on the Civic Ed project, we were on the phone. I don't speak Arabic, so I had an Arabic consultant that I worked with because, I really needed one on that project. And, we were calling our Minister of Education colleague and just calling to chat to see, and he was dealing with all sorts of internal pressures, and we were supporting him emotionally as well as technically, okay, through this process. We were very participatory in our approach, from beginning to end, from the design to the creation of the manual, review process, all that. And that's why it took so long. It's easy to write a manual. There are manuals you can download off the internet. The point is, how do you get a manual, how do you get a civic education manual that they feel ownership of and that they're going to use and that's not going to stay on the shelf? That's your challenge. So how do you design your process and how do you go about your work in a way that it's going to stick? That's what it's about. It was very inclusive, culturally and politically sensitive. We had Iraq examples in the curriculum. We were very sensitive to the political dynamics that were going on in the Ministry of Education, and we even stopped the project for. Am I right for like a couple? I've got like 4 more bullet points. But stopped the project for a little while because there was a change in the leadership in the Ministry of Education, and our partner could not continue, and yet we could have gone forward because Kurdistan, was willing to go forward. They were on a different timetable because the situation was different from that. But we realized that our goal was actually, we didn't want to leave anybody behind here. So we said, okay, screw it, let's just wait. And we had, we were sitting around for 6 months before we could move ahead. We also supported institution building. It would have been a heck of a lot easier to spend this money training some civil society groups, which there's nothing wrong with doing, by the way. But I really wanted to do institution building. Ministry of Education is responsible for educating the next generation of Iraqis. I really wanted to work with them, even though people warned me don't because it's too dysfunctional. Even the Iraqis were telling me don't work with the Ministry of Education because they're corrupt, they're dysfunctional, blah, 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 blah. But I didn't listen, and I'm glad I didn't, because I think that you have to, it's harder, but it's worth it to work with the institutions. And then you had a long-term commitment to ensure local ownership. That was very key. And we were very process as well as results-oriented, not just focusing on the results, but the process and how we went about it. Thank you.
Thanks, Maria, for those very heartfelt remarks. I especially appreciated having highlighted the role of irony in human rights advocacy, but also the importance of rambunctiousness when dealing with perhaps difficult points of view, and also highlighting a process can be as important as products. Really getting ownership is really a really nice concept you tied in there, so thank you for that. As soon as we have Prezi going, here we go. Our next speaker is Amy Rhodes. I see something there, it's looking promising.
So the moral of the story here is it's always good to have a backup of your backup of your backup. After multiple attempts, I think I am actually having to go.
Just have to message you real quick.
Oh, the large event? Did you attend the one that was like a church?
All right.
I already feel triumphant.
You can sit down now.
Yeah, thank you. That'll be
Okay.
Okay.
So,
try.
So first of all, I'd like to echo the other panelists' sentiments that it is a pleasure to be here with this distinguished panel and with you all this evening. Albeit the weather is a bit challenging coming from the Dominican Republic. I stepped off the plane and said, what is this white stuff? I don't understand. I never knew that spring snowstorms existed. So that was a little bit of a shock, but I'm glad to be here this evening, and thank you to all of you for braving the weather as well. I also want to say thank you to the Center on Rights Development, and particularly Monica, with whom I've been corresponding in recent months, getting everything organized for this symposium. So what I'm going to talk about this evening is looking at the right to education, and then looking at it in the context of recent field work that I've done in post-earthquake Haiti. We're going to see if we have clicker abilities. Yes. Okay, so I want you all to look at this particular picture, take a good look at it, and at the end of the presentation, we're going to come back to it and look at it a bit more closely. The question it's asking, the right to education, is it really universal? So here we have a picture of shiny, happy students. Everyone's smiling, raising their hands, they're enjoying their learning environment. For many of us, this is very similar to what our educational experience was growing up. We were in well-resourced classrooms, we had public transportation, we had a meal provided to us when we went to school, we had a teacher that maybe, whether or not he or she wanted to be there every morning, they were paid to be there and they came every day. And that was the context that we grew up learning in. Shiny, happy students. So how many of you, by a show of hands, believe that these children have a right to education, to learn in this classroom every day? All right, good, good. We're on the same page. So a lot of us believe that they have a right to education because morally it's right, because it's important for their cognitive development, but also those of us, many of you sitting in this room who have studied international law, believe also that there is an underpinning social agreement between states that reiterates the right to education internationally. And as we see here in this brochure that is for the annual symposium, it talks about the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which is an important document developed by the United Nations. And another one that also underpins the right to education is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So here it says in Article 26, everyone has the right to education. Education shall be free, at least at the elementary and fundamental stages. Elementary education shall be compulsory. Not only does it talk about access to education and that it should be available to all, but it also goes further to specify what education should do, what it should do. It gives some parameters. Education should be directed to the full development of the human personality and to strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. So we look at that and we think, oh, this is great. All countries have agreed that the right to education, it's important, we all agree on that, but then there are those other contexts. And it's challenging because it's not so easy. There's not always resources to pay teachers. There's not always materials, learning materials. There's not transportation. There's not food. There's not quality. There's not infrastructure. So does the right to education still exist for countries in crisis? And so I'd like to pose that question to the audience. Raise your hand. Do you think the right to education still exists for countries in crisis? Raise your hand if you do. Okay, good. So that's what we're going to look at a bit more closely.
Where are we now?
promise.
the right,
So hopefully my presentation will come back. I mean, what is a conference without some technological glitches, right? So let's forward back to where we were. So reiterating that the United Nations has established that the right to education exists under international law. SOS. I spent a lot of time on it, but I can wing it if needed.
My guess.
So I'm glad that in this room we agree that the right to education does exist for countries in crisis as well. What I'm going to talk about next is my experience working in Haiti, which was a country that is very under-resourced even prior to the earthquake, and after the earthquake became even more challenging context in which to provide education. Okay, so here we have a quote. This is from the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Education, Vernon Munoz, who I had the opportunity to get to know when I was working in Costa Rica. He wrote, "Education mitigates the psychosocial impact of conflict and disasters by giving a sense of hope, sense of normality, stability, structure, and hope during a time of crisis, and provides essential building blocks for social reconstruction and future economic stability." So when we talk about education in emergencies, we're not just talking about the learning for those children in that classroom, but we're also talking about the multiplier effect, because what those children are learning is going to have an impact on that community. And even more so, the ripple effect is going to determine whether that country is able to move forward economically and socially. So here, moving to a specific country context, Haiti, even prior to the earthquake, was the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere. Prior to the earthquake, 76% of the population was living below the poverty line, which is defined at $2 a day, US $2 a day. So if you can imagine a society in where 3 out of 4 people are living on less than $2 a day, just try and wrap your mind around that, because until you're in that context and living that reality day to day, it's really hard to understand. But already Haiti was having a lot of challenges, and then on January 12th, 2010, the country was hit by a 7.3 magnitude earthquake. The earthquake hit just outside of the capital city, near Léogâne, but it had a huge impact, particularly on the capital, because so many people were living kind of on top of each other. The city of Port-au-Prince is estimated to be able to host 700 to 800,000 people. There are currently 3 million people living there. So you think of how taxing that is on sanitary systems, health, and not to mention education. So all of those people kind of living on top of each other, and in addition, there are no building codes that exist in Haiti. So when someone is going to build a house, it's not like a building inspector comes by to make sure that everything is up to standard. So after the earthquake, over 200,000 people were killed, and a lot of that had to do with the fact that the buildings were not built by any standard. So a lot of the more poorly built structures just collapsed on top of themselves. I may or may not have visuals to go with the rest of my presentation. So what that meant, in addition to a death toll of over 200,000, it also meant that the people who were living in those homes suddenly found themselves displaced. The earthquake lasted 37 seconds. So in a matter of 37 seconds, 1.5 million people became displaced in the greater Port-au-Prince area. So all of a sudden, Michael, I appreciate everything you're doing.
Going into the presentation, just go to the slides.
So 1.5 million people were displaced and started kind of building up ramshackle homes wherever they could. And 4,268 school facilities were either destroyed or seriously damaged. And that's over 80% of school facilities in the hardest hit regions, including the capital area, which is the great majority of educational facilities in the country. So what that meant is the international aid community came in and started handing out food and water and tents, and pretty much overnight these enormous tent camps sprung up in the capital area. Hundreds of thousands of people living together without proper sanitation. You know, there weren't porta potties enough for the people that were living there. So a number of problems continued to manifest after the earthquake. And living in the tent camps, which I might have a picture for you shortly, but many children were living in these tent camps and didn't have access to education. And following that, their vulnerability level increased significantly. So many of them were orphaned because of the earthquake. And additionally, living in the tent camps, it became a breeding ground for gangs, a lot of rapes, a lot of gang violence, criminal activity, and for young children who no longer had parents, who didn't have a source of income, didn't have school to go to, gangs kind of offer a sense of protection, and so their susceptibility to gangs increased significantly. Additionally, in the tent camps, as you can imagine, there were many young people who didn't have resources, who didn't have skills. So another sector that they turned to support themselves is prostitution. A lot of young women in the tent camps started selling their bodies as a way to support themselves, sometimes not even being paid in exchange for sex, but being given something to eat in exchange for sex. So this became a phenomenon throughout the tent camps, and also, whether we like to admit it or not, having the presence of the international community also fueled the prostitution within Port-au-Prince. And then following that, trafficking is also another impact following the earthquake, that many young children, particularly those who are orphaned, but not only those who are orphaned, were susceptible to trafficking. We often hear about international trafficking, but we don't hear as much about domestic trafficking, which was also highly visible in the tent camps. A lot of young people were taken in by families to become domestic servants, and this has existed in Haiti for a long time. It's called the Rest-a-Bec system. It started out originally as a way for wealthy families to take in younger, poor children from the rural areas, and in exchange for doing chores in the house, they would provide food and shelter and theoretically access to education. However, in recent years, the system has deteriorated significantly, and these children living as Rest-a-Becs basically become slaves in the homes where they live. Many of them sleep on the floor. They're abused emotionally, sexually, verbally, and a statistic from the United Nations showed that a typical 12-year-old Rest-a-Bec is 5 inches shorter than the average Haitian 12-year-old because of malnutrition and abuse. So this is something that Haitian society doesn't really acknowledge, but it has been seen after the earthquake to increase significantly in numbers because a lot of young people didn't have other options. So then the next slide, we can go to the video actually.
Okay, yeah, that works.
So this is a video that we did in a home for rescued Restavecs, and the slide prior to this said that even child soldiers and child prostitutes and child domestic servants, all of them have dreams, which this video shows.
Qui lève-nous, Timoun? Qui lève-nous? Ou même qui lève-nous? Qui lève-nous? Et ou même, qui lève-nous? Sans ta main. Qui lève-nous? Photographe. Qui laisse encore? Qui ne dit pas dire rêve? Ou même Zaka, l'autre la jour. Qui rêve de gagner?
Rêve Pam, c'était pour dire un cinéaste. Il était difficile parce que moi j'étais un prestat. Moi j'étais à tout, moi pas de même chance tout le petit monde.
Ça te fait rêve la vie possible.
Rêve la vie possible parce que il y a un monde qui va nous chance. Il y a bien rêve.
Chaque petit monde a un rêve. Tout petit monde a un esprit. Tout petit monde a un talent. Chaque fois que nous exploitons un petit monde, chaque fois que nous faisons abus sur un petit monde, chaque fois que nous faisons violence sur un petit monde, nous tuons avec ça. Qui est l'espérance pour Haïti changer, pour Haïti bourgeonner.
Chaque fois qu'on petit monde installé, si on force payer à oublier.
Il faut que ça suspende. Le système extérieur là, il faut l'abolir.
Film ça, nous regarder là, c'est une rêve. Chaque fois que vous regardez film ça, pensez à vous. Pensez à tout petit monde, à tout rêve.
Respecter droit de tout le monde. C'est responsabilité pas vous. C'est responsabilité de tout le monde.
Nous c'est tout le monde.
Nous c'est tout le monde. Nous c'est.
So this is a film that we did as part of a campaign called Frennen Restavek, and which means Stop Restavek Abuse in Haitian Creole. And what we wanted to do was really bring an awareness about this issue to the general public, because this is something that exists in Haitian society but is not talked about, and the government doesn't like to acknowledge that the abuse that continues within the Restavek system, partly because many of them belong to the Haitian elite, and often the elite are the ones who themselves have Restaveks working in their homes. So part of our campaign when we were working in Haiti was to really bring awareness about the Restavek system and the abuse of children's rights, because generally speaking, it's less than 2% of Restaveks that are actually enrolled in school. So what we did as part of the Frennen Restavek campaign, we created different types of two-way communications. This is one. It's a cartoon-based Creole paper, the largest in Haiti, called Chemin Lacaille, and it would visually explain, because a lot of parents that give their children to be Restaveks don't realize the abuse that they will experience or that is inherent within the system. So we were trying to look at both push and pull factors and really educate parents that it's far better to keep your child with you because you care for what's best for your child, whereas if you send that child with someone, a trafficker who comes to your village and promises that child a better life, you have no idea what's going to happen to that child. The next one, should I try this?
Theoretically.
Theoretically.
Okay.
As Dean Anderson pointed out previously, that technology is everywhere and it's growing as a tool for social mobilization and for behavior change. So Frennen Restavek is on Twitter. Frennen Restavek is also on Facebook. And even when you go into the smallest villages in Haiti, there's always an internet cafe and it's always full. So this has been a really valuable tool for us to really raise awareness about human rights, children's
abuse of children's rights within the Restavec system, and we've been able to, we have a call-in center, and people have responded, calling and then allowing us to take children out of Restavec domestic service and get them into school. So then I'm gonna wrap up. The international community has a responsibility to protect the right to education, and that is particularly pertinent in contexts like Haiti, where the state often does not have resources and there are not teachers available. So in following the earthquake, the international community has really rallied together and supported the right to education, but there is still more work to be done. As I mentioned this photo at the beginning, this is a picture of a young Haitian boy. It's taken on the Dajabon border, which is in the north part of the country. He lives in Haiti, but every morning he wakes up and he puts on the uniform of the Dominican Republic school system, and he goes under the gate, traveling internationally to go to school to access education because he doesn't have access to school where he lives. So I think that this picture is really testament to how motivated and really strongly desiring of education the students are, even in emergency contexts where they don't have the access to education. So I guess in summary, what I'd like to say is that good things are being done, but there's still a lot of work to do. So thank you so much. Thank you for bearing with my technological.
Thanks very much, Amy. So now we're running a little late, which I'll take full responsibility for. But we do have a nice amount of time now for Q&A, and so please feel free to ask whatever comes to mind from the panel. So yeah, go in the back there. Yeah.
Hi, this question is for Maria. You discussed a little bit about the issues of the U.S. notion of human rights in Iraq, just because we were sort of the occupying power. I was wondering if you ran into issues of resistance against a Western notion of human rights, and if so, how you dealt with that.
It is something that does exist, that resistance. It wasn't something that existed among the academics that we were working with. Is this working, by the way? No.
I don't think so.
So I should, well, you can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll forget that. It's, first of all, I mean, one approach that you have to take is look at the history of how the UNHCR came about and the process and how inclusive it was and the different countries that participated, including countries from the Middle East and so forth. And if you talk a little bit about the history of that process, it demystifies things. So that was a suggestion that because we were giving the academic strategies to deal with, to how to deal with when people are resistant to hearing about it, and then that is something that they might come across. So that's one thing. Another strategy is to talk about human rights also in terms of universal values and values that can be found in every society, and also Islamic values. And we talked a little bit about how many things are consistent in Iraqi society, Iraqi values, human rights values. So those are different strategies that you can use.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, thank you all for being here today. I really appreciate your time and joining us in Denver. I guess this question maybe goes more to Mr. Shaw, but I guess anybody can answer. I think that schools are interesting because they're a really great space to not only, you're not focusing just on sort of primary education, but it's a space for, in many countries, you can also bring in health interventions. And so, for example, like in African countries, that's where the most successful deworming campaigns have occurred, because you were able to reach greater swaths of the population. So I wonder if there are challenges to kind of adding those additional components to schools, or in like human rights focus or doing other trainings, I guess, in the school place. I wasn't sure what a framework is for understanding that. If you think that's a good idea or a terrible idea to mix some external topics with, bringing it into a school environment. So especially for Pakistan, a big thing is polio eradication. And I wonder if you think it would be a good idea to bring that into a school, or if that would put them more at risk.
No, actually, we have done things other than education through the school management committees which are responsible. We have to engage the community in order to start a school, So, but then it depends on what kind of topics are you going in with. For example, when we went in with energy conservation, everybody was very enthusiastic to come and participate because it would save them money. But when we went in with HIV/AIDS, because this is against Islam and this is against our culture and we don't want to talk about it and so on. So it depends on what kind of intervention we're actually going in with. Then health and hygiene, for example. You go in, you talk about washing hands, and they say we have no water. You can't get them hand sanitizers, So it really depends on, but yes, it has been experimented with and it works well in most cases.
Way in the back there,
Yeah, this is mostly for Amy. Maria discussed working with the Iraqi government despite people's potential advice. I was wondering, in Haiti's government is pretty notorious for inefficiency, corruption, and if you've been able to work with the government in education initiatives.
Yeah, that's a great question. In what I talked about this evening, the Friend and Restavec campaign, that was done not necessarily in collaboration with the government because they actually, in many forums, have not even recognized the Restavec system, even though there's over 300,000 children who are Restavecs in Haiti. But tomorrow I'm going to be talking about a skills development program that we did, and that was closely in collaboration with the Ministry of Education and Professional Training. And so we'll talk a little bit more tomorrow about how we collaborated with the government there. But it is certainly challenging because in Haiti there are very low institutional capacities, and so it's constantly kind of bringing them along with you and saying, all right, let's get on board here. But yeah, that has been an important part of other activities we've done. Yeah.
So this is a question for all of you. Given that you do education in conflict or emergency zones, what is the effect of not having a strong formal economy sector for these educated people to sort of filter into? And I realize it's not necessarily tertiary education you may be dealing with, but do you feel like that's a deterrent, or is that a difficult obstacle to keep people motivated to seek out education opportunities when there isn't necessarily jobs for them to acquire after their education?
Well, I can just speak to Haiti that the brain drain in Haiti is one of the largest in the world, and it is very challenging for the country to develop in large part because every talented, skilled person who has a certification is leaving the country. But in the skills segment that I'll be talking about tomorrow, what we work on a lot, because I work with the International Labor Organization, is not only providing technical skills but also entrepreneurship skills, because when you have 80% informal sector, then really that is essential that young people know how to kind of get the skills to start their own business and really get things going on their own, or get together with a buddy, because there's not numerous enterprises that are waiting for their job application. So that has been entrepreneurship has been an important part of dealing with the lack of a formal economy in Haiti.
In case of Afghans in Pakistan, for example, it's a different situation compared to Haiti, where the country is in crisis. And whereas in case of Afghans in Pakistan, we have a population in crisis from a different country. It is often difficult to motivate the parents of kids to send them to school, because they'd rather be collecting garbage and making some extra money for their families. And also, since the UNHCR's responsibility is more towards providing primary education, and the parents feel 6 years of education and then more. So now what we have done is, as I talked about engaging with new donors, some we do directly and some through the UNHCR, we have been able to upgrade 50 of our schools to middle level, and now we are already waiting for a submission made to BPRM to upgrade rest of the schools to middle level, and then some to secondary and higher secondary levels, to make good use of this, and also to keep the parents and the children motivated that they will get something out of it eventually.
In Iraq, I mean, education, sorry, a little further away, thank you. Need to blow out your eardrums there. No, in Iraq, education is very valued societally. They place value on it, even though in the rural areas you still have the same problem of parents wanting their kids to work or not necessarily seeing the value. But the thing that I came across is there is this focus on teaching things around like the classic things, engineering and medicine and very practical sort of fields. And why teach human rights? Human rights was considered the least important subject that you could possibly teach in a university setting by at least the policy people and so forth. And certainly peace education isn't necessarily a scene, but once you start to engage people and making it very relevant to their lives, and it all comes back to the pedagogy and the way you teach it, and actually showing them how it relates to their lives. And yes, there are ways to make a living peace building and human rights and development and so forth, and be engaged in improving the country. But it's there is an obstacle, sort of a mental block to get over to do that. But I think that's changing. There's a lot more interest now in it.
I'm in the humanitarian assistance program. I've noticed that education is often well underfunded. It gets dismissed as a development situation. How do we change the mindset of organizations to convince them that education is a priority and that needs to be dealt with urgently?
I would say if you find the answer to that, let me know.
I think it suffers from the fact that it's just not sexy enough. Education is something like your mom says, oh, you should be, have education. It's not. It's a branding problem, but it is the most important thing. It's the best investment you could possibly make.
And I think also because people are so focused on life saving, and maybe what we as a community of advocates for education need to do is reiterate education is saving lives too, and it is as valuable as shelter in any emergency context.
With all this emerging discussion about education, I understand it is becoming more and more sexier now, attractive for donors. In case of Afghan refugees in Pakistan, it's a prolonged crisis, late 70s. So there's donor fatigue. There are other issues in the world. So the focus changes. I just briefly want to mention INEE, and INEE is a part of INEE network, and so on. It's the Interagency Network for Education in Emergencies, and one of the aims of INEE is to advocate for education in emergencies. So that's pretty much what can be done, but lots and lots of people are not talking about it. And so.
So going back a little bit to what Deborah was asking, how do you see the connection between humanitarian assistance and like more long-term development goals with education, and how can local governments and as in the international community play to make that connection like stronger, and learning from complex emergencies and conflicts in Latin America. For example, I'm from Guatemala, and the war was long and a lot of teachers were killed and disappeared, and today the country sees that. Like, we're feeling there's no good public education. And so how can we connect the more life-saving, which is important, and the humanitarian setting, and with more long-term goals?
I mean, certainly I think you bring up a really important point that there definitely has to be continuity and long-term planning, even in the emergency and early recovery phases. And I mean, in the case of Haiti, the education system's never been great, even before the earthquake. So it's not just a question of responding to the crisis context, but also each step of the way thinking, how are we empowering the Ministry of Education to be able to continue to provide this? And I think, I mean, in some instances, the international community works on doing some types of partnerships with the Ministry of Education. So like, okay, we'll pay teachers' salaries this month, but you gotta pay them next month. And kind of building in those types of measures to gradually kind of pass the buck and say, all right, Ministry of Education, it's really your responsibility. We're here to help, but we're not gonna be here forever. So those are some steps I think that are taken.
I'd love to ask a question, if you don't mind. Take my moderator's prerogative here. And so you've raised some really interesting questions about sort of the benefits of education, perhaps the sustainability of education. Education is promoting stability. But I wonder if there's some sort of greater challenges that one we can latch onto and use, or challenges that are really threatening this model of education in conflict zones. And so one idea is that I'm curious to hear your thoughts on is, as we're making these investments in people, right, can these people go on and help sustain the educational system by themselves, having benefited from a system, come back and contribute money into an educational system in a conflict zone, so that those people who have now are more productive can come back and continue to support that system that's lacking funding? Or is there a greater problem where we're just going to be educating people in conflict zones or disaster zones such as Haiti, and have people leave these areas and have the brain drain that, Amy, you noted? And so is it all, in that sense, is it all for naught? So I sense kind of a tension in the remarks you made, so I was wondering if you could respond to that. One or all of you. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that will continue to be a challenge, because nobody can dictate and say, you need to continue to support the country where you were born if you don't have opportunities there and you're more qualified than any position you'll be able to find there. But I think in a lot of situations, a lot of different contexts, the diaspora does take an active role, and I think there are certainly ways that we can kind of tap into that even more. And I think there's some creative funding mechanisms, as we realize that education is going to be significantly underfunded in the years to come. Diaspora funds is something that's being explored as a way to kind of support education in developing countries. So that's certainly an idea.
There is a program in Iraq, a scholarship program that has been pretty extensive, and it's structured in such a way where people are sent overseas to study and get master's degrees and bachelor's degrees and whatever. But there is a commitment, and it's for them to come back and work in the country. I think that it's from what I've heard. I haven't researched it extensively. It's working pretty well.
Well, in our schools, when we put the kids through the primary education system, we can just hope, before we started the middle schools, that they will have more opportunity to get higher education. But there have been stories where our primary school graduates got an opportunity to get some higher education, and they came back to become teachers in our schools. So I don't know of any who went to a level where they were able to contribute financially, but at least they decided to come back and work in their own communities as teachers.
Professor Straight.
Yeah, question about what I see ongoing over the decades as a systemic problem. It certainly seemed, or in my work, that there were two ways of approaching top-down, bottom-up, and then government to government, governments work with other governments, and the top-down trying to effectuate some change in government agencies, ministries, and whatnot. And then the NGOs and some IOs were very firm in saying the only way to go about it was a grassroots process. And while that's changed a little bit, there's very few organizations that seem to be both moving top-down and bottom-up. And while there are more, and I'm always grateful to hear organizations that are doing that, there still seems to be a systemic problem of, if the focus is grassroots or the focus is from top down, that there doesn't seem to be a coordinated effort amongst NGOs and even IOs to actually work together. I see Haiti's a perfect example of going to Haiti, or we're going to the townships out of Cape Town, where NGOs are carving out territory of their own and servicing a particular community or particular need without hardly ever talking to each other, and sort of putting their flag of their NGO in place and claiming some kind of victory in helping a certain number of people. All good work, but without very much of any kind of coordinated effort. I keep on hoping that us as human rights and educational NGOs will finally really work together, but I haven't seen that happen yet, and I'm getting older. I'd like to see it before I die. So hopefully that happens. The question.
Yeah, well, they don't call Haiti the Republic of NGOs for nothing. I think it has more than maybe any country in the world. And yeah, I think that there is often challenges, especially in particularly immediately following an emergency, where people are rushing in because there's definitely going to be funding, and then you see different agencies competing with one another. I think some progress has been made in the cluster approach. So there's an education cluster, and it'll have all the different actors in education sit down together. But inevitably, I think you're absolutely right that there's still much more work that needs to be done in coordination before actually rushing out into the field and let's just implement, and not talking to one another. There's definitely progress to be made.
On the civic education, early on I tried to coordinate with another organization whose name starts with the letter U, and and because they were I had heard they had $4.5 million for civic education in Iraq. I said, gee, maybe I should talk to them, because I had a fraction of that. And so I made a special trip. I mean, on my way to Iraq, I stopped in Amman to talk to the people that were in charge of education. And you know, they were very polite. It was a very nice conversation. And they said, well, we kind of have our plan, and we sort of want to, and I was actually very open about what we were doing and what our goals were. And they were actually not very open about sharing what they were doing. And I was a little puzzled by it. I mean, I hadn't had an experience before, with working with them. And so he said, well, we can keep in touch and so forth, but there was no follow-up. And then, and there was a turnover on their project. Like every year they had a different person. And so every year this person would call me up and ask me what I was doing or whatever. And then finally we started to get traction on our project, around year 2. And they realized that the Ministry of Education was actually going to, print the manual, and the Ministry of Education was adopting it, and then all of a sudden they were interested in collaborating. And it was a question because And it was very frustrating to me, and the ministry was very frustrated with them because they felt like they were dealing with a different person every time, and there was a lack of continuity, and it was, and I'm not saying we did everything perfect, by a long shot, we made our share of mistakes, but the coordination also factor is also affected by the funding environment, and how there's these year-to-year funding environments, and it doesn't allow sometimes time for coordination. I mean, I remember in my own agency, we were like, okay, there's funding available from such and such department for civic education, give us some proposals within the next month. You know, how do you coordinate, you know, within a month, you know, to do that? So you've already got your project, and then you start coordinating, and by that point it's really too late. So the funding structure and process also hampers it.
Yeah, in my past 9 to 10 years of experience in working with the humanitarian assistance and development aid sector, I've seen whenever there is an emergency, and what you talked about is NGOs rushing in and putting their flag. We saw that happening in Pakistan when there was a big earthquake in 2005. Especially the NGOs who had more access to funding, you know, they rushed, put in their flags, where the local or the national NGOs were trying to figure out what to do in absence of fund. But in long-term crises like the Afghan crisis and the refugees in Pakistan, it's reasonably coordinated, I would say, between the NGO, the donor, and the government. So I think the crisis needs to be long enough in order to enable everybody to coordinate.
That helps, yeah.
So I think we're actually going to have to end this session there. We're already coming up on 8:30. So I know there's still a few other questions in the crowd. If there's time, as we break out, maybe you can come up and ask individually or ask the panelists if they're around in the coming days. So I'd like to thank all of you for coming and sharing your experiences and thoughts with us. And we're really glad that you could be here. And so let's just give them a round of applause.
Just a last couple comments. I want to thank the Humanitarian Assistance Program for co-sponsoring this panel, especially Deborah for helping work that out. And also, if you're welcome to take your folders home. If you're planning to come back tomorrow or Thursday and you're afraid you might forget to bring it, you can drop it off in the back and we'll have them for you the next couple days. And please leave your name tags